Well, the bell actually rang for a change today, so we do need to go ahead and get going. But it's 5 after. That's the usual start time. But we're continuing these little character studies that we're going to do to the end of the year, and today we want to talk about Luke. I thought Luke would be a good one to look at because we're often thinking about his gospel, particularly the beginning of it, around this time of year. And I want us to begin by sort of putting on, our imagination caps, if we can call it that. I think our sort of pious imagination is helpful sometimes in getting into these character studies because it helps to reinforce that these are real people. They're not just literary characters. They're not just confined to the pages of history, real flesh and blood human beings, just like you and me. And that's really what we're trying to dig into and to take some practical lessons from these little lessons. So, just to sort of put ourselves in that mode, I want you to try to imagine a scene. Luke pores over his notes. Bits of parchment and papyrus are stacked in piles all around the room. There are journals from various trips, notes from different conversations with eyewitnesses, all of them covering the floor of this Roman villa that's his temporary headquarters, a gift from Theophilus, who is the patron of this literary venture. To a casual visitor, all of that appears to be controlled chaos, and maybe a healthier emphasis on the chaos part than the controlled part. But to Luke, this is all artfully organized. As the Apostle Paul's traveling companion and beloved friend for many years, Luke adventured all throughout Asia Minor and then traveled to multiple different countries on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. But now Paul has been arrested in Jerusalem. And as a result of his request as a Roman citizen to have a change of venue, to have his case heard directly by the emperor, he now finds himself in the city of Rome, where he's accompanied Paul there to await his trial in Italy. Luke has proved himself repeatedly to be a consistent, a loyal friend. And of course, the ability for him to administer treatment as a doctor to the disciples whenever they were injured or sick, that was a welcome sort of perk of having him around. The reason for all of these papers and notes scattered around is because of the daunting task that Luke had assumed, to write an account of the life of Jesus. Now, Luke knew he wasn't the only one to assume this task, but there were so many, there were hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands more who urgently needed to hear this good news. An inspiration from God flooded Luke's heart. There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. You can picture Luke's quill moving over the papyrus there in front of him. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. As a physician, Luke would have been familiar with women's pregnancy. And perhaps he spoke at length with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and collected her story, her thoughts, her feelings. Luke would have remembered her telling him about the Messiah's birth. Maybe he spoke with Elizabeth. That was Mary's cousin and the mother of John the Baptist. What were you thinking? What did you feel when Mary came and announced to you that she was going to give birth to the Messiah? What did you do? On and on he questioned the elderly woman, perhaps because he suspected a lot of the other writers would overlook some of these details that he was interested in. And Luke resolved to tell this part of the story. So as Luke penned his account, he utilized many of the other accounts that his contemporaries had written. But just like his singular telling of the story of Jesus' birth, it seems like Luke must have searched out for specific stories and details in the life of Jesus that he felt like some of his counterparts might have overlooked, like the story of the Good Samaritan, for instance. Luke's the only one to record that parable. But for him, it's one of the most important parables that Jesus tells. It defines how we apply that greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? Well, he told that story to answer it. And you can imagine that that parable must have hit even more closely to home for Luke, because as a Gentile, he knew about the pain of prejudice. As a physician, he probably admired the Samaritan's healing touch. Maybe a special interview, a special audience with Mary and Martha in Bethany had given him insight into those two women who were close friends of Jesus. Because the account of Jesus' words to Martha, who was so busy, worried about serving, and to Mary, who was interested in listening to Jesus sitting at his feet, those are only recorded by Luke. One Sabbath day, Jesus encountered a woman outside the synagogue who was crippled and bent from a debilitating disease that she'd suffered from for years. He had compassion on her, and he healed her on that holy day, causing outrage from a lot of those pious people who were standing nearby. Only Luke records that account. And I suspect that traveling with Paul must have given him a renewed sense of determination to record some of these events. Because for years, going along with Paul, he'd kept his own copious notes, a diary of their travels, maybe knowing that one day he would turn them into a book. And so you can almost picture him picking one of these up, maybe a scrap of notes, leaning back, maybe something like, Nain, Jesus encounters a funeral procession. Woman who has already buried husband has lost son. Don't cry, says Jesus. Raises boy from dead. People filled with awe. God has come to help his people. We can picture Luke surrounded by these notes, all alone, praying for God, praying for the power of the Spirit to come upon him and to enable him to tell this story of God's incredible love for his people, made manifest through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then Luke picks up his quill, he dips it in ink, and he continues to write. If we picture that scene, I think it helps us to bring Luke to life. Luke was a Gentile, a Greek. He's mentioned by name only 3 times in the New Testament. Now, I'm not talking about every page of the gospel here where you can look at the top and see Luke there, because obviously that's a later attribution. That's according to tradition. But if you actually go looking for his name, he's mentioned 3 times. All are in Paul's letters. All are in the prison epistles. Paul mentions him while he's in prison. But we know he was a Gentile from the context in which Paul sends greetings on one of those occasions. Flip over to Colossians chapter 4, because if you've never known how we know some of these details about Luke, it's from this passage. Colossians 4, beginning in verse number 7, Paul sends these final greetings from everybody who's a companion of his. Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. And with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who's one of you. They'll tell you of everything that's taken place here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you've received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. All right, you can stop there. Paul's listed off a bunch of his companions. He says, these are the only men of the circumcision. So in other words, those are the only Jewish Christians who were with him. But then he lists some more names. Verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. So there you go. That's how we know that Luke is not only a Gentile, but we know his profession. He's included there among Paul's fellow workers, but not one of those who's of the circumcision. That means he's a Gentile Christian. And he's singled out here specifically by his occupation, a physician. We don't know anything about where Luke received his training or where he was originally from. Luke, of course, wrote the book of Acts. We'll get into that more in a little bit. And if you read through Acts, you'll note that he spends a great deal of time talking about the church in Antioch. He seems to have had some special interest there, and that's led to some to speculating that that might have been his hometown. Maybe he even became a Christian there, where Paul and Barnabas were early leaders in the church. There was also one of the greatest universities in the first century world in Antioch. So maybe that's where Luke received his medical training. We just don't know. That's all speculation, but it's at least plausible. Regardless, when you read through Luke, when you read through Acts, his profession comes through in the sense that the writing style is that of a highly educated man. Sometimes people have talked about the medical terminology Luke uses and how it reflects that he was a doctor, but then some other scholars have done some work on that and said, nah, that's overblown. This was the sort of terminology that would have been common among anyone who was educated. But whether or not it indicates Luke's profession specifically as a doctor, it certainly shows his education level, because when you read through Luke and you read through Acts, he's trying to mimic classical Greek in the way he tells his story. You don't even have to be someone who reads Greek to understand that. You know, compare it to something like Mark that we just spent a lot of time preaching through. Mark's gospel, man, it's all about action and one thing moving to another, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. Luke tells his story in a completely different way. It's just a different style of storytelling that comes through more if you read it closely. Wherever he first encountered, he ultimately accompanied him to Troas during his second missionary journey. And we know this from Acts chapter 16 and verse number 10. This is the first so-called we section of Acts. Talking here in a section we looked at just last week when Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra, and there's a disciple there named Timothy. That's all told in the third person. He says, then they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, etc. I won't read all this. Then there's a vision that appeared to them to go to Macedonia, all in the third person, until you get to verse 10 of Acts 16. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So there's a shift. Luke's gone from telling this story as an outsider, talking about what Paul and his companions do, to now he's right there with them. And that's why in our little imaginary account earlier, we talked about Luke keeping notes, a diary of their travel, because that's what a lot of the sections of the back half of Acts are like. Personal notes, a diary kept in real time that he later went back and expanded into this larger work. Dr. Luke evidently gives up his medical practice to accompany Paul. I guess, sort of first medical missionary in a way, if we could think of him like that. Troas is a city in the northwestern part of modern-day Turkey. And from there, as we read, they get this call to go into Macedonia. That was the province that's north of Greece. And they go to the city of Philippi, which was an important city in the first century world. And if you continue reading through Acts, Luke evidently remains behind there in Philippi, because this whole account, Acts 16, everything in Philippi is written with Luke as a participant in this first person plural. But then you go to chapter 17, verse 1, when Paul leaves. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, etc. So, in other words, Luke accompanies Paul from Troas to Philippi. Paul goes on to Thessalonica, but Luke, based on the way he's telling it, he's not there anymore. So he must have remained behind in Philippi for some time. And in fact, unless he left and went on some other missions that we don't know about during this period, because he doesn't follow himself in the telling of the story, he remains there for another 7 or 8 years when we start to put the timeline together, until he rejoins Paul on his third missionary journey. This is in Acts chapter 20 and verse number 6. Paul's going back through. He departs for Macedonia, and this is when he's on his way kind of back home. In verse number 5, these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. So it seems likely that Luke remained in Philippi that whole time. We don't know for sure, but that's where Paul picks him back up again. He left him in Philippi, and he picks him up in Philippi, and they sail back for Troas here. From this point on, Luke is the constant companion of Paul for the remainder of his life. Because if you remember, this whole journey from Philippi, then back to Troas, he's going to meet with the Ephesian elders at Miletus. He's on his way back to Jerusalem, where he's going to give a report, and that's when he's ultimately arrested, thrown into prison. I can imagine that during this difficult period of Paul's life, that Luke was a huge help to him, because you think about some of the things that Paul went through: beatings, imprisonment, that notable shipwreck towards the end of Acts. Luke would have been there throughout all of this. And, I don't know, maybe that's how Luke met Paul in the first place, way back when, if Paul had suffered some sort of beating and he happened to need to go to a doctor to attend to him, and that's how he met Luke. We don't know. But he was there through these labors, and at times, no doubt, he shared in the labor of teaching and preaching as well. But what we most know Luke for are his writings. Now, remember that Luke, highly educated, he's a doctor by profession. He is someone who is accustomed to disciplined study. That's just how he's lived his whole life. And at some point, he decides to undertake this massive assignment. On the one hand, writing an account of Jesus' life, and then secondly, writing a sequel to that would be an account of the earliest history of the church. Now, Luke, as a Gentile, Luke was not an eyewitness to Jesus' life. He wasn't there for that. He didn't become a disciple till later. And in fact, he doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. He specifically states that he wasn't. If you go to Luke chapter 1, I've mentioned this before, but he sort of gives in the first 4 verses his kind of purpose statement here, what he's trying to do in his gospel. And even though we, again, imagined these interviews and these scraps of different sources and such, we're not stretching it in the sense that we know he used good sources, that he didn't have this himself. He went and he dug into it and he researched it. He says that explicitly. Luke 1:1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, So he says, I wasn't an eyewitness. It's been delivered to me. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. So Luke acknowledges, hey, I didn't see this, but I wanted to put this all down in order, take from these eyewitnesses all their accounts, and make sure that we have an accurate written record for your benefit and for others, so that you can have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. Those years that he spent with Paul while Paul was confined in Caesarea would have given him ample time to do this, because Caesarea, you remember, that's just to the north, in the northern part of Palestine. I don't know if it happened this way, but it's always been my best guess, and not just from me, it's what a lot of people think. But I think it's likely that during those 2 years Paul's in prison in Caesarea, that's probably when Luke had the chance to go and interview people, do some of this digging around, go and talk to some of these individuals who were still alive and get their firsthand account of who Jesus was and what he did. Once Paul then sailed to Rome for his trial before Caesar, Luke joined him on that voyage. And on the way, their ship was destroyed near the island of Malta. Everyone who was there just barely escaped with their lives. You remember this from the end of Acts. But once he was there in Rome, he had at least 2 more years to continue working on this project. If you recall where the book of Acts ends, that Paul continued for 2 years there in his own hired house. And it seems like Luke just brings things up possibly to the present day there. But at any rate, that would have given him several years. I mean, what else is he going to do while Paul's there in prison? That would have given him a couple of years to organize all this, to write all of this. And because Luke had been with Paul through so much of this, because he'd personally visited so many of the cities that Paul had, he could have collected detailed accounts of what happened, not only his own diary extracts, but no doubt he talked to Paul. He got Paul's firsthand account of what went on, but he could record that way from talking to people, what happened when the Spirit descended at Pentecost? What happened as the gospel spread throughout the known world? What happened to Paul in all these places where he wasn't there along with them? Luke accepted this assignment that had been given to him by God, and I think it's really interesting. His writings are the only ones in the New Testament written by a Gentile. Everyone else is a Jew, and that gives him an interesting perspective. That's why it's usually been thought that his gospel was written for Greeks, for a Greek audience, because this is someone that he could speak to. He spoke the same language, came from the same background. Not only to try to reach out to Greek, to Gentile unbelievers, but especially to strengthen those who already were believers, like Theophilus. And I think that background is even more interesting when you consider things like the theme of Acts. What's one of the great themes of Acts? It's that not just Jews are God's people, Gentiles are accepted into God's people too. Well, don't you know that was something that held special interest for Luke as a Gentile believer? It's no wonder he spends so much time emphasizing that the gospel is for everyone. And you consider just how important Luke is. If you ever have looked and, seen just how lengthy Luke's gospel is and then the book of Acts is, Luke is personally responsible for more than a quarter of the New Testament. So we're strongly reliant upon him, especially in his account of the history of the early church, because he's the only one that was inspired to write an account of those earliest days. And because we're reliant upon him as a historian there, this is one of those things that interest me. It's remarkable to me just how precise and how accurate and trustworthy he is as a historian. In the 19th century, when it became increasingly common for there to be skeptics about the reliability of the Bible, Luke, in particular, came under fire from some of these revisionists, these skeptics. You can't trust him. That guy, he made up so much of his story. It's just full of inaccuracies. Well, there was a fellow named Sir William Ramsay who was an unbeliever and who was one of the foremost archaeologists of his day, late 19th century. Ramsay held that view too, that Luke was completely unreliable, inaccurate. Much of this was fictitious, until he went to Palestine, elsewhere in the Near East. He went to Greece. He went there trying to prove just how inaccurate Luke was, and Acts in particular was. And instead, he became convinced that Luke was entirely accurate. And ultimately, he became a believer because of that. And just to give you a few examples of Luke's accuracy in the book of Acts, where once it was questioned. And these seem like minor things, but these are the sorts of things critics would point out, why you just couldn't trust this book. Luke states that Derbe and Lystra, a couple of cities that we looked at last week when we talked about Timothy, he states that Derbe and Lystra were in Lycaonia, Roman province. And he implies then that Iconium, where they went to, was not then in Lycaonia. That's chapter 14 and verse 6. And some of these skeptics say, well, that's wrong. We know that Iconium was in Lycaonia because of a reference in Cicero, and of course we can trust Cicero. Until then, a monument was found in Iconium, where it was said to be in a different province, Phrygia. Realize that that shifted over time. It was said at one point that his usage of technical terms was sloppy. So he talks about the city leaders in Philippi as praetors. That's the term he uses. That was said to be incorrect. But then we found that that title was actually used in Roman colonies, which Philippi was. Politarchs, that's what he calls the magistrates in the city of Thessalonica. Nobody'd heard that term. That thought he just made that up. That was wrong, until we found 5 different inscriptions that have referenced politarchs as the city leaders in Thessalonica. He talks about how that riot broke out in the temple. Remember, this is ultimately why Paul gets arrested, because they claimed that he'd taken a Gentile there and he was worthy of death. And you know this, I've talked about this before in other contexts, that we found inscriptions that have in multiple languages there on the inner court, the wall, prescribing the death penalty for anyone who would take a Gentile into that inner court of the temple. I could give more examples of this, but here's the point. This is from A.N. Sherwin White, who is not a New Testament scholar, not a Bible historian. He's a Roman historian. He says this, and this is back from the 60s. He says, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. I think that's fascinating, and that should bolster our faith, that you can read this and you can trust it. Even a secular Roman historian says, Acts is reliable, we take it for granted. But that's important because Luke's project was so serious, he's the only one who writes this history. But I think more importantly than that, even, if you get right down to it, and remember these are character studies, how do we read that Paul refers to him? The beloved physician. That descriptor, beloved, tells us a lot about his character. He's a doctor. He's someone who was trained to be concerned with and to care for the needs of people. And in his writings, we find that concern for people come through again and again. If you look at Luke's gospel, and I mentioned earlier some of those stories that only he records, Luke's peculiar material like that seems to be primarily focused on people. Luke was concerned about individuals, and most of those parables that are unique to his gospel center attention on people. You compare that to Matthew's gospel, for instance, where most of his unique parables, and really most of his parables in general, they're focused on the kingdom of heaven. Luke's concerned with people. And you see that, for instance, in the Good Samaritan, which we mentioned, or the most famous parable of Jesus, again only in Luke, the prodigal son. Luke's concerned with those human portraits. You could think about some of the other stories he tells that are unique to his gospel. The priest, Zechariah, who's the father of John the Baptist, the cousins, Elizabeth and Mary, and their reaction to the news that they were going to have children. The tax collector, Zacchaeus, poor, sad Cleopas back on the road to Emmaus. All of these and many others, these are personal portraits that just spring to life through the story that Luke tells. I imagine that Jesus' focus on people is something that impressed Luke greatly as someone who'd given his own life to that same sort of concern. He's obviously attracted to people himself, and you see that particularly in how he focuses on people who are otherwise so often ignored. There's a great emphasis in Luke's gospel on social outcast. You see, we've seen that in the other gospels, but Luke, more so than any of the others, he talks about those who were ostracized. So the immoral woman, the sinful woman who comes and anoints Jesus' feet. Luke chapter 7, verse 36. The transformation of Zacchaeus, we know that story. Luke chapter 19. The repentance of the robber, the thief on the cross. Luke's the only one that records that. Luke chapter 23. We have the parables we've already mentioned of this sort of gracious attitude, the prodigal son, but there are others. The two debtors, that is the unmerciful servant. Luke's the only one who records that. The Pharisee and the publican who go up to the temple to pray, one to justify himself, and the tax collector says, "Be merciful to me, a sinner." Luke's the only one who records that. Luke is very focused on portraying women positively. He mentions 13 women who are not mentioned by name anywhere else in the Gospels. He gives particular attention to stories like the widow of Nain, whose son Jesus raised, only son Jesus raised from the dead. The women who lamented Jesus on the way to the cross. Women figure prominently in much of his story, in the birth and in the resurrection narratives. And Luke focuses on children more than any other gospel writer. He's the only one who talks about the childhood of John the Baptist and the childhood of Jesus. On 3 different occasions, he mentions only children in his gospel. That aforementioned child of the widow of Nain, Acts 7:12, and then also 8:42, 9:38. The whole point of this is Luke cared about people. And you see that come through especially in his focus on those who are on the margins of society, those who are ostracized, on women, on children. And you see that even in his service to Paul when everyone else had abandoned him. Remember, we saw this a couple of weeks ago when Paul writes to Timothy, asking him to bring Mark. What does he say? 2 Timothy 4, verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Everybody else had abandoned him, but Luke was still there, faithfully serving him to the end. And so from Luke, I think we can take a few practical lessons just as we've wrapped up every week here. First of all, I'd say, give God the very best that you have to offer. Give God the best that you have. Remember how Luke says that he began his gospel? We could sum it up. We'd say he did his homework, basically. He'd researched this, he'd studied this, he'd gone into exhaustive detail to try to write this orderly account. So you think about his research, you think about his writing style. He gave the whole world an accurate picture of Jesus, the proof to substantiate his claim. He has this detailed account of the early history of the church that even modern Roman historians find to be trustworthy. That reflects someone who was not only well-educated, but someone who poured his life out into that work, did the very best that he could. And the question for us is, in whatever we're laboring at for God, do we approach our service in the same way? Do we give it our all? Do we give it our very best? Are we just sort of, cobbling it together? Do we just sort of show up here on Sunday and, kind of go through the motions and then forget about it and go back about our business? Or do we actually endeavor to give everything that we have to him in whatever we're called to do? We're all different members of the body. We all have different talents, different abilities, but we're all called to do something. There's some service that we all can render, and however we serve God, whatever area it is, we need to be giving him our very best, like Luke did. Secondly, Luke reminds us that sacrifices are required in serving God. Luke records, this is one of those things that he records specifically. Chapter 9, verse number 23, Jesus says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself?" We see this in other Gospels too, of course, but Luke gives a specific emphasis to it here in chapter 9. He tells us, Jesus said, whoever's going to follow him essentially has to be able to count the cost, the way he puts it elsewhere. Now, Luke was a man who was well educated. He was someone who had a respectable profession, but he chose to give all that up to live this life as an itinerant missionary, following Paul around, serving God there at his side. And it reminds us, discipleship is costly. We talk sometimes about the way things are in our contemporary society. We worry about how it seems like a lot of our culture is turning against Christianity. We feel increasingly marginalized and put upon, and like maybe we're not too far from the point where Christians are actually going to be mistreated. But discipleship is supposed to be costly. It was never promised to be easy. In fact, quite the opposite. And I would suggest that where the church is too comfortable in the world, it's not really because the world has become favorable towards the church. It's because the church has become too much like the world. And so we're called to be willing to give up for Christ, to take up our cross, as he says there. Are we just dabbling in our commitment to Jesus? Or are we fully and completely sold out for him? We need to be willing to count the cost and decide, along with Luke, that it's worth it. Because on the other side, we'll find that whatever we've done here hasn't been in vain. And we can be incredibly useful for his cause, just like Luke was. And so finally, with that in mind, third, last lesson, look for opportunities to serve others, because there's some service that you can render, whoever you are, whatever your position is, whatever talents and abilities that you have. Paul was a highly respected, highly esteemed, highly skilled Christian worker. But even Paul needed Luke. I think about, if you've ever read any of the Sherlock Holmes stories and Dr. Watson, and there's one place where Holmes says, I'm lost without my Boswell, talking about Watson as his biographer. Even Paul needed Luke there with him by his side throughout all of his labors. And that reminds us that everybody needs help, everybody needs encouragement, everybody needs support, everybody needs service at some times. Even those who were esteemed, even those who were leaders in the church, even those who seem like they're just getting by fine, no problems. They may have something that they're hiding. Ask God to give you a compassionate heart. Ask him to give you eyes to see. Ask him to give you hands to serve others. Luke's gospel shows how he viewed that, because he emphasized that sort of service and compassion so much himself. Paul's letters show how he lived that out himself. So let's try to emulate him. Don't withhold ourselves. Let's give it our all and look for those opportunities to serve others just as he did. perfect timing. Questions or comments or anything? Observations? All right. Thanks for your attention this morning.